Hi, this is Dr. Joe Green, head pastor of Antioch Assembly Church located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also the founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. One of the most frustrating things that I experience on a regular basis is people that want to debate and argue with many of the videos I do and the talks, but they do so with no facts. And I just want to say for the record, every point that I make and every hypothesis that I present is given with a large amount of research. I read books on the subject, I listen to lectures, and I research articles and declassified government documents to back up my views. Many of the things that I'm confidently expressing are subjects in which I previously held an opposing position on. But one thing I always try to do, I always try to stay open-minded and go about researching things with a level of scrutiny and skepticism. I'm not above being challenged on my perspectives, but most of the people that challenge me are simply espousing long-held views that were actually a product of the ruling elite's mainstream media's talking points. The vast majority of the contrasting views are based on emotions and lack deeper understanding of the issues that we're facing. And C, the loudest opposition that I face mostly comes from people and groups that are affected by the issues negatively to a greater degree than others. For example, the foundational ideology behind Planned Parenthood and the abortion industry is racism. So in America, a lot of black people are really decrying racism and they're really upset about racism, but they actually inadvertently end up supporting the most racist strategies while rejecting those who are trying to expose these racist strategies. For example, like I said, Planned Parenthood was based on racism, and the abortion industry, the foundation of the ideology behind Planned Parenthood, is based on racism. Margaret Sanger was a person that believed in ethnic cleansing and what is known as social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is a philosophy that holds the perspective that some races are more evolved and civilized than others. In order to preserve humanity to its highest degree, a society is best suited to reduce the population of the more inferior races. Sanger believed that since you couldn't openly eliminate people from the inferior races, the better strategy was to convince them to stop procreating. Thus, the name Planned Parenthood replaced the name the American Eugenics Society and the Bureau of Social Hygiene. Primarily, the reason that they changed the name is because eugenics received a bad reputation because of its attachment to Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. And I have books on the subject, copies of governmental documents, where they openly express that abortion is a tool of the population control and things of that nature. And even though black women were the main focus of the racist philosophies behind abortion, black women are the most outspoken for abortion. Those are the ones that defend abortion the most. And that's just one of the most glaring examples of what I'm referring to. What we see here is currently is an attempt to destroy America and destroy Western civilization. And again, this is not my opinion. It's not something I made up. It's actually what they expressed. You know, the powers that be, the globalists, if you will, the order of the Illuminati, and those who are tools and puppets of the Illuminati. Now, I know most people will tell me that I'm over-exaggerating and how ridiculous that sounds. But the main reason why that is like I stated earlier, the global elite have been practicing and have perfected what is known as social engineering, also known as mass mind control and manipulation. They've been using media, the educational system, and what is known as controlled opposition for a very long time. They have perfected it. And there's several books that you can read that details the strategies of the ruling elite. There's a book by Margaret Sanger entitled The Pivot of Civilization, in which she discusses what is known as the Negro Dilemma in America. After slavery was abolished and blacks started to grow stronger and greater in number in the community, they needed to find a way, the powers that be that is, to reduce the population, and thus they came up with the idea of Planned Parenthood. Now I'm going to read a couple of quotes from Margaret Sanger's book, The Pivot of Civilization. And like I said, if you get a chance, you can read it for yourself. But I want you to hear it in her own words. You know, like I said, a lot of times people will argue points with me and with no type of support. They've just been indoctrinated in a certain way of thinking. So this one in the Pivot of Civilization, I don't want to read the whole thing. I just want to get to the meat of it. But she says, nor could I then realize the number of the power of the enemies who were aroused into activity by this idea. So completely was I dominated by this conviction of the efficacy of control that I could not until later realize the extent of the sacrifices that were to be exacted of me and of those who supported my campaign. The very idea of birth control resurrected the spirit of witch hunters of Salem. Could they have usurped the power, they would have burned us at the stake. Lacking that power, they used the weapon of suppression and invoked medieval statutes to send us to jail. These tactics had an effect on the very opposite to the intended. They demonstrated the vitality of the idea of birth control and acted as a counter-irritant on the actively intelligent sections of the American community. Nor was the interest aroused confinedly merely to America. The Neo-Malthusian movement in Great Britain, with its history of undoubted bravery, came to our support. And I had the comfort of knowing that the finest minds of England did not hesitate a moment in the expression of their sympathy and support. Now, she mentions Malthusian movement. Malthus is where you get the idea of Malthusian philosophy from, and it's based on survival of the fittest. So what they believed is that human beings, the population of human beings was going to grow so great that the ruling elite, the more evolved races, would lose their, the access to resources. And so they believed that since that they were higher elevated, or they were more, they were the more desirable races, then they had to be proactive in reducing the population of the other races. You also had Galton, you had Francis Galton, you had Charles Darwin. Most of you are familiar with Charles Darwin. These were the Europeans that came out of the Enlightenment era, and what they did was they believed that society had a certain elite class. So the most intelligent people, the educators, the art people in arts. You had what's known as the Illuminati, which is the Rothschild family and other bloodline families, and they employed the best and the brightest in society. And they believed that the best and the brightest of society were the ones who deserve to have access to all the resources of the planet. And so they had this idea that other people, they had to come up with the idea behind birth control with Margaret Sanger is to control the birth in the less desirable races. And I'm going to read a couple more quotes from her, but that was her ideology behind birth control, was controlling the birth in the various races. And the time that she's coming around, you're talking about the early part of the 20th century and the latter part of the 19th century. Slavery was abolished. You had the Negro communities growing, and she believed that these people were delinquents, that they were criminals, that they were imbeciles, and all these other things she believed. So she believed that in order for society to prosper, they had to reduce the populations of those societies. Another quote from this book, this is page 14. Perusal to the reports of infant mortality is widely varying industrial centers of the United States, published during the past decade by Children's Bureau of United States Department of Labor, forces us to the realization of the immediate need of detailed statistics concerning the practice and results of uncontrolled breeding. Some such efforts as this has been made by Galton, like I mentioned, Francis Galton, by Galton Laboratory of the National Eugenics in Great Britain. The Children's Bureau reports only incidentally present this impressive evidence. They fail to coordinate it. While there is always the danger of drawing giant conclusions from pygmy premises, here is overwhelmingly evidence concerning irresponsible parenthood that is ignored by governmental and social agencies. So she believed that they shouldn't leave people having children up to the people, that the government should get involved and the government should have something to do with it. Now, when she talked about these people that were defective humans, she called them imbeciles, she called them human weeds, and of course we know that she was also, Charles Darwin's, the theory of, the origin of the species through natural selection, which is the theory of evolution is based on. that they believed that the white race was the superior race and that the Negro race was inferior. And this is all part of Charles Darwin's book. Francis Galton, also Robert Malthus, and Margaret Sanger also held to the same view. And so they believed that society shouldn't leave the decision up to the lower races, the inferior races, and other people, that they shouldn't leave it up to them to procreate, but they should get involved. And she said that they shouldn't take a laissez-faire attitude towards that because they felt that the population was going to get out of control if they didn't do something about it. This is another quote. This is chapter 3 from The Pivot of Civilization. She says, "These young men were the children of yesterday. Authorities tell us that 75% of the school children are defective. This means that no less than 15 million school children out of 22 million in the United States are physically or mentally below par." That was a quote from her book. She says 75% of the, and that's where we get this idea of the ruling elite or the one percenters. She says 75% of the children in America at the time when she's writing this word was defective. Now, of course, what people will say is it wasn't strictly targeting blacks, but blacks were high on her list of what she called human weeds. Here's another quote. This is page 37. "The philosophy of birth control points out that as long as civilized communities encourage unrestrained fecundity in the normal members of the population, always, of course, under the cloak of decency and morality, and penalize every attempt to introduce the principle of discrimination and responsibility in parenthood, they will be faced with an ever-increasing problem of feeble-mindedness, that fertile parent of degeneracy, crime, and pauperism. Small as the percentage of the imbecile and half-witted may seem in comparison with the normal members of the community, it should always be remembered that feeble-mindedness is not an unrelated expression of modern civilization. Its roots strike deep in the social fabric." So she talked about, these feeble-minded, she was talking about feeble-minded, imbeciles, half-witted, and degenerates, criminals, and how they were very fertile. So she said they had to do something about them because they keep having all those babies. She also makes quotes in here about how this is about charity. So what she believed is charity was actually wrong because she was a social Darwinist. So she believed that when you gave charity to poor people and the needy, that ultimately you were enabling them and you were allowing them to prosper, and you should just let them die. That's basically what she said. I'm paraphrasing. But let me read this particular quote. It says, "Those vast, complex, interrelated organizations aiming to control and diminish the spread of misery and destitution and all the menacing evils that spring out of the sinisterly fertile soil are the surest sign that our civilization has bred, is breeding, and is perpetuating constantly increasing numbers of defectives, delinquents, and dependents. My criticism, therefore, is not directed at the failure of philanthropy, but rather its success." So she said that the more you kept giving charity to these inferior races, they just keep breeding, and it was just going to choke everything out. So that's Margaret Sanger. She's the one who is the founder of Planned Parenthood. And so when we're looking at racism, it's always interesting of how they ultimately, black people end up defending Planned Parenthood. And anytime you talk about pro-life or anything like that, then black people reject that. This big fight right now with Judge Kavanaugh, primarily at its core, is about pro-life versus pro-choice. And so, President Trump said in his, during his campaign, that he was going to elect conservative pro-life judges. And so the liberal left that are pro-abortion are in panic mode. So that's why this is a huge fight, and that's why they're pulling out every single thing that they can. Now, when we're talking about the ruling elite, the globalists, and the reason I always bring this up is because right now they primarily have targeted disproportionately blacks and other minority groups. So Planned Parenthood, even though black people are less than 13% of the population, abortion accounts for 35% black people. So they've been targeting black people since their inception. Most of the Planned Parenthood facilities, 80% of them, are near black and poor neighborhoods. That's not a coincidence. That is intentional. They target them. There's another book out by Henry Ford, and you're familiar with Henry Ford. Henry Ford is the founder of the Ford Motor Company, and he's one of the founders of the automobile industry. And he wrote this book called The International Jew. Now, just to put this in its proper context, when I talked about the ruling elite, you have these bloodline families, including the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Windsors. Most of you may be familiar with the Windsor family. That's the royal family in England. The Windsor family, the Rockefellers, people believe the Kennedys are a part of that, and several other families. They are what's known as the ruling elite. They have other organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, and other people that help them to carry out their plan. They also invite people from the educational, so the academic realm, entertainment, the media. They invite them to these organizations, these clubs, to help them to carry out their plan. So Henry Ford writes in his book, it's called The International Jew. So when we talk about the Jews, we're not talking about all Jews. We're talking about these Zionists, these globalists, if you will, the what's known as the Illuminati. And here's what Henry Ford writes. He writes about this document. It's called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which is another book I would suggest to you to read, because it outlines their strategy for a new world order, or for one world government and one world governmental system. And so they believe that the biggest threat to their system, to their strategy, is Western Judeo-Christian culture. So they do a lot of things in order to destroy. The foundation right now of the Western Judeo-American culture is the United States. Western culture, I should say. So here's what Henry Ford writes. It's called, the book is called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It's the blueprint to the Illuminati's one world governmental system of how they plan on achieving this. So here's the fifth protocol. And it says, a world coalition of Gentiles could cope with us temporarily, but we are assured against this by roots of dissension among them so deep that they cannot be torn out. We have created antagonism between the personal and national interests of the Gentiles by arousing religious and race hatred, which we have nourished in the hearts for 20 centuries. So they're saying that they intentionally try to stir up dissension between the races. And so you have this thing with Margaret Sanger, who is a eugenicist. She tries to blame black people for the destruction of Western culture, of America. So then in return, black people are told that white people, in general, they use the general idea of white people, that they're trying to destroy you, and this is based on white supremacy. But in essence, it's not white supremacy, it is the globalists. And they use white versus black paradigm in order to push their agenda. So this is Henry Ford talking about the Jewish protocols, or the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. If you get a chance, read this book. Like I said, a lot of people argue with me about these strategies, but they haven't read these books. Most of them don't even know that these books exist. This is regards to the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. The documents most frequently mentioned by those who are interested in the theory of Jewish world power rather than the actual operation of that power in the world today are those 24 documents known as the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. The protocols have attracted much attention in Europe, having been the center of an important storm of opinion in England, but discussion of them in the United States has been limited. Who was the first entitled these documents? Not the name of the Elders of Zion is not known. It would be possible without serious mutilation of the documents to remove all the hint of Jewish authorship and yet retain all the main points of the most comprehensive program for the world subjugation that has ever come to public knowledge. And so what Henry Ford is saying is that these documents are real, even though they're trying to pretend like they're not. And so again, if you get a chance to read these protocols, and I have a copy of it, and so all these strategies that we're talking about are the real strategies. And let me give you a couple of quick quotes here from the book. So protocol number 2, part of this is destructive education. It says, do not suppose for a moment that these statements are empty words. Think carefully of the successes we arrange for Darwinism, which is evolution, like I mentioned earlier, the theory of evolution, Marxism, which is communism, Nietzscheism, which is socialism. To us Jews, at any rate, it should be plain to see what a disintegrating importance these directives have laid upon the minds of the Goyim. And the Goyim are considered the Gentiles or the non-Jews. Now, these are Kabbalistic Jews. These aren't regular Torah observant Jews. They're Kabbalistic Jews. But they said that these are the three of the main strategies that they employ. So Darwinism, as we talked about Margaret Sanger and eugenics, that's based and rooted in Darwinism. Marxism, which is communism, and Nietzscheism, which is socialism. So you see a real push in this day and age for people pushing towards Marxism and socialism. And most people don't even realize just how detrimental it is and how these are just part of the strategies of the global elite. I'm going to read this other segment. This is section 5 of protocol number 2. It reads, in the hands of the states of today, there's a great force that creates the movement of thought in the people, and that is the press. The part played by the press is to keep pointing out requirements supposed to be indispensable to give voice to the complaints of the people, to express and to create discontent. It is the press that the triumph of freedom of speech finds its incarnation. But the Goyim states have not known how to make use of this force, and it has fallen into our hands. Through the press, we have gained the power to influence while remaining ourselves in the shade. Thanks to the press, we have got the gold in our hands, notwithstanding that we have had to gather it out of the oceans of blood and tears. But it has paid us through we have sacrificed many of our people. Each victim on our side is worth the sight of God 1,000 Goyim. And so they're admitting how they use the press to promote their agendas. And, socialism, communism, and Darwinism are 3 of the primary things. Let me read a book, because the Rockefeller family is one of the families of the ruling elite, of the globalists. David Rockefeller's Memoirs, which is another book that I have that I would like to read a couple of quotes to you. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, they, of course, acknowledge the fact that that they want to use the press and that they want to bring dissension. And let me read this quote. David Rockefeller said this in a 1991 speech to a group, I think it was the United Nations. He writes, or his statement was, we are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But the world is more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supernatural sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practice in past centuries. So again, we have this philosophy of this ruling elite making decisions for the world. And so, like Margaret Sanger said, even in regards to having childbearing and birth, that the ruling elite, the globalists, shouldn't sit back and allow the public to determine their own, but they wanted to make these choices for them, which is why they came up with Planned Parenthood and the abortion industry. They also socially engineered and convinced the public that these things are acceptable, which is why you have this huge fight right now that people are in a frenzy. Anytime you talk about abolishing abortion in America, overturning Roe versus Wade, the left and the liberals get like frantic because they've been convinced that this is an attack on women's right to choose, or a woman's health issue. You have this whole Me Too movement, and you have the feminist movement, the second wave feminist movement, as it's called, which is trying to destroy the culture by overthrowing gender roles, also by emasculating men. And one of the dangers of this whole thing is when you have women that could, the process in the American system, judicial system, or just the system as a whole, is based on innocent till proven guilty. So you have in this era now that if a woman makes an accusation with no type of evidence, then she's automatically to be believed and the man has to prove his innocence. And that's backwards. That's not how the system is supposed to work, because it's nearly impossible for me to prove a negative. So if you accuse me of something that I didn't do, you don't have the right to accuse me of something that I didn't do with no evidence and then require me to prove that I didn't do it. The burden is on the accuser. And I'm not saying this to be insensitive to anybody, but we have a dangerous precedence when people can just they can just accuse people of something with no evidence. It sets a precedence, but that's intentionally being done. They're pushing this Me Too movement and the feminist movement to not only emasculate men, but also to disrupt the gender roles, traditional gender roles, which is part of what they expressed in their protocols of Zion, of the elders of Zion. They're intentionally trying to disrupt the family structure, overturn the traditional gender roles in order to destroy the public as a whole. They've convinced the masses, especially women and liberals, that abortion is a woman's right, even though they're ignoring the fact that abortion is literally killing a baby. And the foundation of abortion is not only racism, but it's also based on the globalist New World Order push, because they want to reduce the population of these, they call them useful idiots or human feeders. These are things that they say in their documents. It's not something I came up with. David Rockefeller gives credit to them because he's one of the Rockefellers are one of the ruling elite families. He gives thanks to the press because, like the learned elders of Zion stated, they were going to use the press to promote their agenda. Here's another quote from David Rockefeller's memoirs. This is page 405. And he says, it reads, "For more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum has seized upon well-publicized incidents such as my encounter with Castro to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world. If you will, if that's the charge, I stand guilty and I'm proud of it." So he's admitting that he's pushing for a new world order. He's part of a cabal, him and his family, and that they are pushing for this to take place. So like I said, it's amazing how even though all the documents out there, I have all the books, I have the quotes, I have their speeches that they have, I have the documentation that talks about how that's what they're doing, because of the social engineering and because of how they've taken control of the press and the media, and because most people have become, they call us useful idiots, because most of us don't read, we don't do the research, we make decisions based on emotions and not based on logic, and when someone tries to give the truth, the masses reject it. Jesus said, you stoned the prophets that I sent to you. And, when Moses was trying to bring Israel out of the wilderness, there was a lot of people that grumbled and complained because Moses was trying to set them free. And so we have the same mentality, this groupthink, if you will, that's really rejecting the foundational things that are helping to free the human, humanity. See, these global elite, these 1%ers, if you will, they basically want to make the rest, the 99%ers, as slaves to them. So they want to reduce the population or make the others as slaves. I know it's hard to believe because a lot of people want to believe that men are inherently good at its core. That's the deception that we've been told. But you have to also understand that these people that we're mentioning, they actually believe that they're descendants of Nimrod and the gods. In Genesis 3, when the serpent said to Adam and Eve that if you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you can be as gods and you can determine what's right and what's wrong. And so that's the philosophy that they stand by. That's who they think that they are. And so because of that, they can determine what's right and what's wrong. And since the ends justify the means in their mind, but they don't think that these things are wrong. Let me see if I can find this one quote. Here's a quote there's a book by Fritz Springmeier called The Bloodlines of the Illuminati. It was written in 1995, and He reads, I received David Hill's research manuscript 2 years after I began reporting on the 13 families. David Hill had done what I originally done. He had asked questions and began to dig into who pulled the strings in this country. Bob David and I discovered the names of some of the more obvious powerful families. Now, it's 13 original families, but there's also American offshoots. So I'm going to read the names of these families. He said, for instance, in David's notes, he writes, it's a fact, the Mellons, the Carnegies, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Dukes, the Astors, the Dorrances, the Reynoldses, the Stillmans, the Bakers, the Pines, the Colemans, the Watsons, the Toots, the Kleinworths, DuPonts, Warburgs, Phippses, Graces, Guggenheims, Milners, Drexels, Winthrops, Vanderbilts, Whitneys, Parkinsons, and other super-rich Illuminati families generally get along quite well with the communists, because communism is one of the tools that the Illuminati is using to push their agenda. And this is the interesting thing about it. He says that these rich families, they get along quite well with the communists, who supposedly want to take away the wealth of these men to give it to the people. However, this is only double talk designed to bolster the superstructure of delusion that communists are the enemies of all capitalists. But communists, like the super-rich families, are not the enemies of the monopoly capitalism, but they are the foes of free enterprise. And so, you know, again, this is all part of the conspiracy. It's called the Hegelian dialectic. They control both sides of the narrative. They are deceiving the American public. And when you look at this show, like these hearings with Kavanaugh, you have to look deeper beyond the surface. I'm going to leave you with this. One of the things that we fall into as, you know, the average person is we think locally and we think temporally. So we think about how things affect us right now, which is based on our emotions, and we think locally. So, for instance, in politics, the liberals and the Democrats that are really the ones who are, you know, really pushing the globalist agenda right now more than any other group. There may be a local politician who's a Democrat who comes and reads to the kids in school or who looks out for you. You might know him or her, and you have a connection with them. So it's hard for you to believe the overall conspiracy that's taking place. We also think about right now, because these people that are planning these for the one world government, they think multi-generationally. So what they do is they begin to plan their strategy 100 years out. And so because of that, if you're thinking temporally and locally, and these people are thinking globally and multi-generationally, then you're at a disadvantage. So you have to look deeper beyond the surface. You have to go beyond your emotions, and you have to understand that not only is the documentation here to prove all the things that I'm saying, but it's written in the scriptures that that's what takes place at the end of the age. Mystery Babylon, the mother of all harlots. It's an one world economic system, religion, and governmental system. And that's what the powers that be are moving towards. So it's time for the masses to wake up so that we don't get taken advantage of. The Bible tells us to know the devices and the schemes of the enemy so that he does not take advantage of you. So keep your eyes and your ears open. I'm going to have part 2 probably tomorrow. I'm going to do part 2 of this, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, peace and blessings. And may the Lord open your eyes and your ears so that you can see the truth and that you can move against the schemes and the devices of the enemy. Be blessed. Bye-bye.